The trading floor erupted into chaos as red numbers cascaded across giant digital screens. David said, "This can't be happening." His voice trembled as he clutched his phone, staring at collapsing stock prices. The air buzzed with panic as traders shouted orders, their faces pale with fear. Sarah whispered, "We're bleeding out fast." She pressed a trembling hand against her forehead, eyes locked on the falling graph. David could feel his pulse pounding in his temples, each drop on the screen tearing at his confidence. He slammed his fist against the desk, muttering, "It was supposed to be secure." Around them the room smelled of stale coffee and sweat, the sound of ringing phones mixing with curses. Mark leaned close and said, "The investors are pulling back, they've lost faith." David felt a chill run down his spine, the floor beneath him seeming less stable by the second. He had built everything from scratch, and now it was unraveling. He whispered to himself, "Not like this, not today." The moment felt surreal, as if the world had decided to crush him without warning. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of David's office, casting striped shadows across the wooden desk. He sat in silence, staring at stacks of reports, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Sarah entered quietly and said, "You haven't been home in days." Her voice carried concern but also a trace of exhaustion. "I'm down, didn't you?" David rubbed his temples and muttered, "Every decision feels like a trap." The room smelled of stale coffee, and scattered papers littered the floor. A framed photo of his family leaned against the desk, unnoticed. Mark followed Sarah in, his tone sharp as he said, "The lenders are circling, and they don't care about excuses." David looked up at him, jaw tight, frustration etched across his face. He said, "They built this noose, and now they're tightening it." Sarah's eyes softened, her voice breaking, "You can't fight this alone." David's silence stretched, heavy with doubt, as the office clock ticked louder, a cruel reminder of time slipping away. That night, the city lights glimmered beyond the office window like distant stars, mocking his despair. David leaned against the glass, staring at the skyline, his reflection overlapping the city below. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "There's still a way out." Her voice carried both hope and uncertainty. He shook his head, replying, "Every option is poison." Mark's voice cut in from behind, hard and unforgiving, "Then pick the least deadly." The air grew colder as silence lingered. The hum of traffic below was drowned by the weight in the room. David whispered, "I gave everything to this company, and it's slipping through my fingers." Sarah's eyes filled with sadness, her grip tightening on his shoulder. Mark remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on the floor. David closed his eyes, the glow of the city reflecting off his weary face. The night felt endless, heavy with the burden of choices. The next morning, David sat across from the investor in a sleek conference room, the silence sharp as steel. Richard, the investor, smiled thinly and said, "Your losses are my opportunity." David's jaw tightened as he replied, "You're not here to help, you're here to own me." Richard leaned back in his chair, polished cufflinks gleaming in the sunlight, and said, "Business is survival, emotion is a liability." Sarah's eyes narrowed from across the table, her fists clenched beneath the surface. David leaned forward, his voice low, "I built this company brick by brick, and I won't hand it to you." Richard chuckled, his gaze cold. "You already did, the moment you signed the loan." The room's glass walls reflected the tension, trapping them inside like a cage. The silence that followed was louder than words, the weight of inevitability pressing down. Later that evening, David walked through the quiet corridors of his office building, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing like whispers of defeat. He stopped at the framed photos lining the walls, each one showing milestones of the company's rise. His eyes lingered on a picture of the ribbon-cutting ceremony, his younger self smiling with unshakable pride. Sarah caught up to him, her footsteps soft, and said, "It feels like a lifetime ago." David touched the glass of the photo, his voice heavy back then. It felt unbreakable. Mark's voice came from behind, sharp with frustration, dwelling on the past once saved tomorrow. David turned, his eyes wet. "It's not the past I mourn, it's the future slipping away." The empty hallway stretched endlessly, each step echoing the weight of loss. The building no longer felt alive, but like a monument to everything at risk. The pressure mounted as David stared at the stack of overdue notices on his desk, the paper edges curling from overuse. His office once felt like command central, but now it felt like a bunker under siege. Sarah entered with another report in her hands and said, "The vendors want guarantees or they'll walk." Her tone carried a tremor that betrayed her calm posture. David exhaled sharply, his voice low. "They smell blood in the water." Mark leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "They've waited for this. Now they're circling like vultures." The air was heavy, the hum of the air conditioner the only rhythm in the room. David rose slowly, his tie loose, his shoulders bent as though the weight of debt dragged him down. He whispered, "Every call is another demand, another ultimatum." Sarah reached out gently but stopped midway, unsure whether to comfort or hold back. Mark's words cut again, "Hope won't pay them back, and they know it." Silence stretched as the clock ticked, mocking each wasted second. The late afternoon sun spilled through the cafe windows, bathing the wooden tables in golden light. David sat hunched forward, nursing a cold cup of coffee, his eyes hollow. Across from him, Sarah leaned in and said, "You don't have to do this alone." Her voice softened, her hand brushing across the table as if to reach him. David shook his head slowly, muttering, "They've stacked the deck, every path is a trap." The chatter of other patrons felt distant, muffled against the storm inside his head. Mark slid into the booth beside Sarah, his presence sharp as he said, "If you hesitate, they'll crush you completely." David lifted his gaze, his jaw set. "Every decision feels like surrender." Sarah's eyes shimmered with determination, whispering, "Then we find the fight that still matters." The warmth of the cafe clashed with the cold tension between them, as David's reflection in the window looked older than the man who had entered. The conference room smelled of polished wood and stale tension. David sat opposite Richard, the investor, who tapped a silver pen against a leather folder. Richard's smile was sharp as he said, "You need me more than ever." David's knuckles whitened against the table, his reply terse, "Your money isn't help, it's a leash." Sarah sat between them, her eyes darting nervously as she whispered, "We need to listen, at least hear him out." Richard leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks, his tone silky. "I don't gamble without knowing the odds. Right now yours are worse than poor." David leaned forward, his breath heavy. "You want my company, not my survival." The glass walls reflected the trio, distorted like a warning. The silence between words felt like a negotiation of wills. Richard's chuckle echoed, "You'll see this as salvation when the dust settles." That evening, David found himself in a quiet bar, dim lights glowing against rows of untouched bottles. Across from him sat James, the mentor who had once ruled Wall Street, now a shadow of his former self. James lifted his glass slowly and said, "The system doesn't care who it chews up." David frowned. "I thought you'd tell me how to fight it." James smirked bitterly, lines etched deep across his weathered face. "Fight it? I lost everything trying." The bar smelled of whiskey and regret, the hum of jazz in the background. David's voice cracked, "So what's the lesson then?" James leaned closer, his tone low. "Survival isn't about fairness, it's about ruthlessness." David recoiled slightly, staring at the man who was both a warning and a guide. The weight of James's words pressed down harder than the dim shadows, as David wondered if he too would end the same way. The office felt colder that night, the glow of computer monitors painting the room in ghostly light. David sat alone, his tie undone, his eyes fixed on spreadsheets that blurred with exhaustion. Sarah entered quietly, placing a hand on the back of his chair. She whispered, "You're slipping away piece by piece." David muttered, "This company was my life. Now it feels like my cage." Mark appeared in the doorway, his tone edged with frustration. "Then break free before it buries you." David turned slowly, his face pale from fatigue. "If I walk away, it all collapses." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears, her voice trembling. If you stay, so will you. The silence after her words was heavier than any financial report. The screens flickered, rows of numbers shifting, as if mocking his indecision. David's reflection on the screen looked more defeated than alive. A man trapped in the weight of his own ambition. The boardroom was no longer neutral ground, it was Richard's arena. He sat at the head of the polished oak table, his confidence radiating like a weapon. David felt cornered, every eye in the room following his every breath. Richard leaned forward, his voice deliberate from this point forward. No decision leaves your desk without my approval. David's jaw tightened, his hands pressed flat against the table. Sarah sat beside him, her notebook open but her pen motionless, her silence louder than protest. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from one man to the other, reading the power shift. David forced his voice steady. This isn't partnership. It's control. Richard smirked, his tone calm yet lethal. Call it whatever you want. The outcome is the same. The hum of the city outside could not mask the suffocating silence within. The balance of power had tilted, and David knew he was losing more than his company. He was losing himself. The dim parking garage smelled of oil and damp concrete. A figure emerged from the shadows, a former employee with eyes darting nervously. David froze, unsure if this was coincidence or warning. The man spoke in a hushed tone. They're hiding numbers, off-the-books deals, things you won't find in the reports. David stepped closer, suspicion mixed with desperation. The whistleblower's hands trembled as he passed a folder, its edges frayed, its contents damning. Sarah clutched the folder tightly, whispering, "If this is true, it changes everything." The man's eyes darted toward the exit, fear etched into every gesture. "Be careful," he muttered. "They'll bury anyone who talks." Tires screeched in the distance, the echo amplifying the tension. David's voice dropped to a whisper, "Then they've already set the trap." The man slipped away into the shadows, leaving only the smell of gasoline and the weight of secrets too dangerous to carry. Morning light filtered into David's office, but the brightness did nothing to soften the blow. Richard stood across the desk, his smile sharp as broken glass. He held the whistleblower's file, casually flipping through the pages as if reading a menu. "Interesting reading," Richard said smoothly, "but dangerous fiction." David's pulse pounded, his voice barely contained. "You got to him, didn't you?" Richard's chuckle was low, calculated. People are loyal only until they're paid not to be. Sarah stood near the window, her face pale, eyes locked on the folder that once promised salvation but now felt like betrayal. David's voice cracked. "You've turned truth into a weapon." Richard snapped the folder shut, his tone final. "Truth is irrelevant. Perception is everything." The silence was crushing, broken only by the distant sound of traffic below. David realized each step forward was being erased before he could take it, the walls closing in with every word. The office break room felt suffocating, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Mark slammed his coffee cup onto the counter, liquid spilling over the edge. "You're letting him walk all over you," he said, his voice sharp. David sat at the small table, his head resting in his hand, too tired to answer. Sarah stood between them, her voice pleading. "This isn't about pride, it's survival." Mark's face flushed red as he snapped, "Survival without dignity isn't worth anything." David finally lifted his head, eyes hollow. "You think I don't know that? Every move I make, he's already anticipated." Sarah's voice cracked. "We need to hold together, not tear apart." The three stood in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where trust should have been. The rift between them widened, each word leaving scars that couldn't be erased. The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant, the pale green walls casting a sickly glow. David sat at his father's bedside, the steady beep of machines filling the silence. His father, frail and gray, whispered with effort, "You built something strong, but strength is nothing without peace." David's throat tightened, his voice cracking. "I thought I was fighting for us, for the family name." His father's hand trembled as it rested on his son's. "Names fade. People don't." Sarah stood quietly at the doorway, her eyes glistening, unable to intrude on the private pain. David leaned closer, his eyes burning. I don't know if I can hold on. His father's faint smile carried both sorrow and wisdom. Then let go before it takes everything from you. The monitor beeped steadily, a cruel reminder of mortality. David realized the fight had already cost more than balance sheets could measure. It was costing his soul. The courtroom was heavy with tension, polished wood gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. David sat at the defendant's table, his tie loosened, his face pale but resolute. Across the aisle, Richard's lawyers shuffled papers with calculated precision, their confidence unnerving. The judge's gavel cracked against wood, silencing whispers. Sarah leaned close, her whisper steady. This is where truth still matters. David nodded faintly, though doubt gnawed at him. Mark sat behind them, arms crossed, his loyalty tested but not broken. Richard entered with a quiet arrogance, nodding slightly at David, as if acknowledging victory before the fight began. The murmur of the gallery faded into silence, as the clerk called the case. David inhaled deeply, his chest tightening under the weight of what was at stake. It was no longer just a battle for control. It was a battle for survival of his name, his legacy, and his soul. The witness stand creaked as the whistleblower returned, his nervous eyes darting around the courtroom. His voice trembled, but his words cut through the silence. They paid me to stay quiet, to bury the truth. The gallery gasped, a ripple of shock echoing through the room. Richard's lawyer rose swiftly, objecting with practiced authority, but the judge's gavel cut the noise. David gripped the table, heart racing, Sarah's hand brushing his arm for calm. The man's voice grew steadier, the numbers were fabricated. The deals were hidden. Richard leaned back in his chair, his smirk faint but unshaken, as though the testimony was nothing more than theater. The tension mounted, each sentence building toward collapse or redemption. For the first time, the truth was not buried in shadows. It was spoken aloud, impossible to ignore. The cross-examination was merciless. Richard's lawyer paced like a predator, each question sharpened to discredit the trembling witness. So you admit you took money? The man's voice broke. Yes, but to survive, not to lie. The lawyer sneered, convenient. And now, conveniently, you come here with this story. Murmurs spread through the gallery, doubt creeping back into the air. David clenched his jaw, fists pressed against his knees, powerless to intervene. Sarah's whispered plea reached him. Hold steady. The judge's eyes scanned the courtroom, gavel ready for order. The witness lowered his head, his courage cracking under the relentless assault. Richard leaned forward now, his gaze fixed on David, silent triumph in his eyes. The trial was no longer about facts, it was about perception, and perception was slipping through David's grasp. Evening settled as the trial recessed. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, microphones flashing like weapons. David shielded his eyes from the bursts of cameras, Sarah close beside him. Mark fought to push the crowd back, his voice hoarse from shouting, "Give him space." David's chest burned as questions rained down. Is it true? Did you know? His silence was deafening, his jaw locked tight. Richard stood at the far end of the steps, basking in the spotlight, his smile crafted for the cameras. Sarah whispered, "Say nothing. Let the storm pass." David nodded, though every fiber in him longed to shout the truth. The city skyline loomed behind them, a cruel reminder that the world was watching, and one wrong word could destroy what little ground remained. The hotel room was dim, curtains drawn against the city lights. David sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped, his tie discarded on the floor. Sarah sat across from him, her voice breaking. "You can't keep letting him dictate the fight." David's eyes were hollow, fixed on the carpet as if answers might appear. "He owns the room, the story, even the silence," he muttered. Sarah reached for his hand, firm and steady. "Then stop playing his game. Create your own." Mark stood at the window, arms folded, watching traffic snake through the streets below. His tone was gruff but supportive. "She's right. You've been reacting. It's time to strike." David lifted his head, the weight still crushing but a flicker of resolve in his eyes. The battle wasn't over. The rules had to change. David's office was silent, save for the quiet hum of the city below. The folder from the whistleblower lay open on the desk, every page a ticking time bomb. Sarah leaned in, her eyes scanning the numbers, lips pressed tight. If we expose this now, it could ruin him. But it could also ruin us. David rubbed his temples, the weight of every choice pressing down. Mark stood near the window, arms crossed, voice low but firm. We either fight smart or we get crushed. David's mind raced through every option, every strategy, every risk. Each second felt like a year as he realized that one misstep would cost everything. His hands trembled slightly as he finally whispered, "Then we fight smarter, not harder." The team exchanged silent nods, a fragile pact forming amidst chaos. Every heartbeat echoed like a countdown, each one closer to the moment of truth. The press conference room buzzed with energy, microphones pointed like spears at David. Cameras flashed, capturing every blink, every word. He stepped up to the podium, heart hammering, voice steady but measured. "What you are about to hear will change everything you thought you knew." Sarah stood beside him, nodding subtly, her presence a quiet anchor. Mark held the stack of documents tightly, ready to hand them over if needed. The crowd murmured, anticipation thick in the air. David inhaled, the city skyline through the glass behind him glinting like judgment. He flipped open the folder, each page revealing deceit, manipulation, and lies that had been buried. His gaze swept the room, the weight of every eye pressing down, knowing that one wrong word could shatter everything. Richard's office was dark, shades drawn, his figure looming against the city lights. He flipped the folder in his hands, his smirk unwavering. "So David finally decides to play," he murmured, voice low and deliberate. Across the room, his assistant trembled slightly, unsure of how to intervene. Richard's eyes narrowed, scanning every detail, calculating the counterattack. Each sentence in his mind was a chess move, every gesture a piece in a game of destruction. He tapped the folder on the mahogany desk, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Let's see if he survives the first round." Outside, the city thrummed with life, oblivious to the silent war unfolding in glass towers. Richard's confidence radiated, a storm waiting to strike. The trading floor was a storm of movement and sound. Screens flashed red and green, brokers shouted, and David navigated through the chaos. Sarah followed closely, whispering updates as they came in. "We're getting responses. People are reacting." Mark guided them toward a quieter corner, shielding them from the frenzy. "Keep calm. Every reaction counts." David's eyes darted between screens, graphs, and messages. He realized that the tide could shift with one strategic move. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but determination set his jaw. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure was not an option. Every heartbeat felt synchronized with the flashing numbers, a rhythm of war. Night fell over the city as David, Sarah, and Mark gathered on the rooftop terrace, overlooking a skyline shimmering with lights. Exhaustion etched every line of their faces, yet there was resolve. "We did what we could," David said, voice quiet but steady, eyes fixed on the horizon. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not over, but we've taken back some control." Mark nodded. "And we know how to fight now." The cool wind carried away the remnants of tension, leaving a fragile sense of victory. For the first time in months, they breathed freely, aware that battles lay ahead, but comforted by their unity. The city below was indifferent to their struggle, yet their hearts carried the weight of every choice, every risk, and every triumph. David sat alone in the dimly lit office, staring at the spreadsheets glowing on the screen. The weight of the losses pressed down like a physical force. Sarah's warning echoed in his mind, "Every move now is a gamble, but some risks we cannot avoid." He rubbed his eyes, recalling Mark's words, "We've survived worse. Focus on the next play." Outside, the city lights blinked like silent judges, indifferent yet intimidating. Every message, every email, every phone call carried potential disaster. David inhaled deeply, trying to quiet the storm of doubt inside him. The silence was broken by the faint click of the elevator as Sarah entered, eyes steely, holding a new financial report. "This could be the leverage we need," she said, hope and caution intertwined. The boardroom was tense, chairs pushed back slightly as executives whispered, papers shuffled, and coffee cups rattled. David presented the new strategy with careful precision, voice steady but charged with urgency. "This is our chance to regain control," he stated, glancing at Sarah, whose eyes mirrored his determination. Mark handed over detailed charts, outlining potential moves. A low murmur of skepticism rippled through the room, yet David held the floor with commanding presence. He weighed every question, every objection, every glance, knowing that a single misstep could unravel the plan. The minutes stretched, filled with tension and anticipation, a fragile balance between hope and potential disaster. Late evening found the trio at a quiet cafe, the hum of the city below a distant pulse. David sipped his coffee, thoughts racing faster than his heartbeat. Sarah leaned in. "We need to anticipate Richard's next move, or he'll corner us again." Mark nodded, scanning his tablet. "Every vulnerability we had before can become a weapon now." David's mind replayed the past battles, each mistake a lesson etched painfully. He knew that one miscalculation could undo months of effort. Yet in that dim light, surrounded by the quiet murmurs of strangers, he felt a spark of clarity, a strategy forming that might finally turn the tide. The trading floor buzzed with renewed energy as David, Sarah, and Mark implemented the new plan. Screens flashed, numbers spiked and dipped, and brokers shouted in excitement. Sarah relayed critical updates in real time, voice sharp and precise. "We've triggered the hedge and responses are favorable." David's eyes flicked between monitors, every decision a calculated risk. Mark guided them through the chaos, keeping them shielded from distractions. The stakes were higher than ever, but confidence replaced fear. Each successful move sent a ripple of hope through the team, a delicate dance with fortune that could make or break everything in seconds. Night had fallen over the city skyline as David, Sarah, and Mark gathered on the terrace overlooking the glowing lights. Exhaustion and exhilaration mingled on their faces. "We've pushed back," David said quietly, "but Richard isn't finished yet." Sarah rested a hand on his arm. "We're ready. We know how to counter him now." Mark looked out at the city, "And this time, we hold the advantage." The wind carried the cool scent of the night, rustling papers and clothing lightly. Though the battles ahead remained uncertain, a sense of cautious victory settled among them. Their unity, trust, and resilience felt stronger than any obstacle Richard could throw at them. David stared at the city's skyline as dawn broke, the first light glinting off glass towers. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from exhaustion and clarity. Sarah stood beside him, voice calm. "We've learned the rules of the game." Mark joined them, eyes sharp. "Now we know how to defend our vision." Every past failure and misstep flashed through David's mind, each lesson etched in memory. This was not victory, but preparation. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself. The battles ahead were uncertain, yet for the first time in months, he felt a sense of controlled purpose, a strategy emerging from the chaos. Inside the office, the team gathered around a large table, blueprints, charts, and laptops scattered across its surface. David leaned forward. "This is our chance to rebuild smarter, stronger." Sarah pointed to key figures, voice firm. "We minimize risk, prioritize ethics, and focus on long-term growth." Mark adjusted his glasses. "Every lesson from the past guides our next move." The room hummed with energy, tension replaced by determination. They were no longer reacting to crisis, they were designing the future. Every glance, every nod, every decision carried weight, but it was a weight they bore together, united and prepared. The trading screens blinked rapidly as David executed carefully planned moves. Each number represented a calculated risk, each decision measured and deliberate. Sarah relayed updates, voice steady, all positions secure, responses favorable. Mark monitored incoming reports, offering insights silently. The floor pulsed with energy, yet the trio remained composed, a stark contrast to prior chaos. David felt the thrill of mastery, of control regained. They were no longer at the mercy of chance. Strategy guided them now. Every fluctuation was a test, but for the first time they were ready. Evening settled over the city as David, Sarah, and Mark reflected on their progress. The quiet hum of computers and distant traffic filled the space. David spoke softly. "We've faced betrayal, setbacks, and chaos, but we endure." Sarah smiled faintly. "And we adapt, ensuring we protect what we've built." Mark nodded. "This is our turning point. We fight with knowledge, not desperation." Outside, the skyline shimmered with city lights, reflecting both the challenges behind and the possibilities ahead. They felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration, the calm after a storm, yet aware the world of finance never truly sleeps. On the rooftop, under the starry night, David gazed at the horizon, the city alive below. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. Sarah rested a hand on his arm. "Every challenge ahead is ours to face." Mark stood beside them, confident. "We've built resilience. We've learned it. Nothing can shake that." A soft wind carried the sounds of the city, a reminder of both the stakes and possibilities. They were ready for whatever came next. The journey had been harrowing, yet it forged strength, unity, and clarity. They faced the future not with fear, but with strategy, trust, and resolve.